Mark Harrison and David Williams had been best friends since they could remember. Growing up in a small town where everyone knew each other, they were practically inseparable. Their bond was unbreakable, or so it seemed. Mark was the charismatic and adventurous one, always looking for the next thrill, while David was the grounded, rational thinker who kept Mark in check. They balanced each other perfectly, and together they navigated the challenges of adolescence and young adulthood. When the time came to leave for college, it was only natural that they would go together. They chose a university far from home, eager to escape the small-town life and experience the excitement of the city. College life was everything they had hoped for: freedom, parties, new experiences, but it also brought new challenges. While David excelled in his studies and quickly found his footing, Mark felt a growing sense of restlessness. The lectures and social life weren't enough for him. He craved something more, something deeper. Mark began exploring different clubs and activities on campus, searching for that elusive feeling of fulfillment. It was during one of these explorations that he stumbled upon a flyer for a Philosophy of the Eternal seminar. The title intrigued him, and without telling David, he decided to attend. The seminar was held in a dimly lit room in an old building on the edge of campus. The atmosphere was mysterious, almost eerie, and Mark was immediately drawn in. The speaker was a man named Alistair, who exuded an air of wisdom and authority. His voice was deep and mesmerizing as he spoke about life, death, and the possibility of transcending the limitations of the human experience. Mark was captivated. Alistair introduced the idea of the Eternal Circle, a group that claimed to have discovered the secrets of eternal life. Mark was skeptical at first, but the way Alistair spoke with such conviction and certainty made him curious enough to stay after the seminar and ask questions. Alistair welcomed Mark into the group, sensing his curiosity and desire for something greater. The meetings were small and secretive, held in various locations off campus. The members of the Eternal Circle were an eclectic mix of individuals, each with their own reasons for seeking something beyond the ordinary. As Mark attended more meetings, he found himself drawn deeper into their teachings. Alistair had a way of making everything seem clear, as if he was revealing hidden truths that had always been just out of reach. Meanwhile, David began to notice the changes in Mark. His friend was becoming more distant, often disappearing for hours or even days without explanation. When Mark was home, he was withdrawn, lost in thought, and no longer the carefree, adventurous person David had always known. David's attempts to talk to Mark were met with vague answers or outright deflection. Concerned, David tried to follow Mark one evening, but Mark had become adept at slipping away unnoticed. One night, after weeks of growing tension, Mark finally revealed his involvement with the Eternal Circle to David. He spoke passionately about the group, about how they were on the brink of discovering something truly extraordinary. David listened in disbelief as Mark described their beliefs, but he was even more disturbed by the fanatical gleam in his friend's eyes. Mark was completely enthralled by Alistair and his teachings. "Mark, this sounds like a cult," David said bluntly. "These people are brainwashing you. You need to get out before it's too late." Mark shook his head, dismissing David's concerns. "You don't understand, David. This is real. They've shown me things that you wouldn't believe. Alistair says that we're close to achieving eternal life, but we have to be willing to sacrifice everything." David was horrified. "Sacrifice? What are you talking about?" Mark hesitated, then looked away. "It's nothing. Just forget I said anything." But David couldn't forget. He began researching cults and secret societies, desperate to find a way to pull Mark out of the dangerous path he was on. However, Mark's transformation continued, and the more David pushed, the more Mark pulled away. As Mark became more entrenched in the cult, Alistair began to test his loyalty. The group's teachings became darker, more demanding. Alistair spoke of a ritual that would grant true members of the Eternal Circle eternal life, but it required a significant sacrifice, something precious, something irreplaceable. Alistair hinted that Mark was ready for this next step, that he had shown the dedication needed to be among the chosen few. Mark was conflicted. The idea of eternal life was alluring, but the thought of the required sacrifice filled him with dread. Alistair sensed Mark's hesitation and began to manipulate him, playing on his fears and desires. Alistair told Mark that only by cutting ties with his mortal life could he transcend it, and that the greatest tie he had was his bond with David. At first, Mark recoiled at the thought. David was his best friend, his anchor, but Alistair was relentless, slowly convincing Mark that this was the only way. He twisted Mark's perception, making him believe that David was holding him back, preventing him from achieving his true potential. Alistair even suggested that David, with his rational and logical mind, would never understand or support Mark's journey, and that in time, their friendship would crumble under the weight of Mark's new beliefs. Mark's mind became a battleground of conflicting emotions. He began to distance himself from David even more, avoiding him whenever possible. He started spending more time at the cult's compound, where Alistair continued to groom him for the ritual. The compound was located deep in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the outside world. It was a place of secrets and shadows, where the group performed rituals that grew increasingly strange and unsettling. David, sensing that something was terribly wrong, decided to take action. He reached out to Mark's parents, old friends, anyone who might help him stage an intervention. But Mark was elusive, and every time David tried to confront him, Mark would deflect or disappear. The once unbreakable bond between them was now strained to the point of breaking. One night, after weeks of tension and failed attempts to reach Mark, David decided to follow him to one of the secret meetings. He trailed Mark through the woods, careful to stay out of sight. As he approached the compound, he saw the flickering lights of torches and heard the low hum of chanting. David's heart raced as he realized how deep Mark had gone. Mark, unaware that David was following him, entered the clearing where the cult had gathered. Alistair was waiting, surrounded by the other members of the Eternal Circle. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation as Alistair announced that the time for Mark's ascension had come. Mark's mind was a whirlwind of fear, excitement, and confusion. He knew what was expected of him, but the reality of it was almost too much to bear. As Alistair led Mark to the center of the circle, the cult members began their ritualistic chants. Mark's hands trembled as he took the ceremonial knife that Alistair handed him. The weight of what he was about to do bore down on him, but Alistair's voice was in his head, urging him to complete the ritual, to make the sacrifice that would grant him eternal life. Just as Mark was about to speak the words of the ritual, David burst into the clearing. The chanting stopped abruptly, and all eyes turned to David, who was breathless and wide-eyed with fear. "Mark, what the hell are you doing? We need to get out of here," David shouted, his voice trembling. Mark froze, the knife heavy in his hand. For a moment the spell was broken, and he saw David, as he always had, his best friend, his brother. But then Alistair's voice cut through the fog of doubt, sharp and commanding. "Mark, this is your moment. He's trying to stop you from achieving your destiny. Don't let him stand in your way." Mark's eyes filled with tears as he looked at David. The conflict inside him was overwhelming. He wanted to drop the knife, to run away with David and forget this nightmare, but Alistair's influence was too strong. The cult members began chanting again, louder this time, their voices a chorus of insistence. David took a step closer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Mark, please, you don't have to do this. Let's just go home. We can figure this out together." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to believe David, to trust in their bond, but the promise of eternal life was too tempting. Alistair's words echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. With a cry of anguish, Mark raised the knife. "I'm sorry, David," he whispered, barely audible over the chanting. Before David could react, Mark plunged the knife into his best friend's chest. The chanting reached a fever pitch as David collapsed to the ground, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Mark fell to his knees beside David, his hands shaking as he realized what he had done. The knife slipped from his fingers, and he stared in horror at the blood pooling around them. The cult members began their final incantation, sealing the ritual. But Mark no longer heard them. His world had shattered in an instant. and all that remained was the lifeless body of his best friend. Alistair approached, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. "You've done well, Mark. The path to eternity is now open to you," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. But Mark felt nothing but emptiness. The days that followed were a blur. Mark returned to the city, but the weight of his actions crushed him. The promised rewards never came. Instead, Mark was haunted by visions of David, his friend's face twisted in pain and betrayal. The guilt gnawed at him day and night until he could no longer bear it. Unable to live with what he had done, Mark turned himself in to the authorities. His confession was incoherent, filled with ramblings about eternal life and the cult. The police were shocked by the bizarre and brutal nature of the crime. They arrested the remaining members of the Eternal Circle, but Alistair had vanished, leaving no trace behind. Mark was sentenced to life in prison, where he descended into madness. He was plagued by nightmares and hallucinations, his mind unraveling under the weight of his guilt. David's face was always there, a constant reminder of the friend he had betrayed for a hollow promise. The walls of his cell became his world, and in the darkness, Mark realized the true cost of his actions. He had sacrificed everything, his friend, his sanity, his soul. And in return, he was left with nothing but the echoes of a love that had turned into an eternal curse. The cult's promise of eternal life was a lie, but Mark's suffering was real, and it would last for the rest of his days. In the end, Mark understood that there was no escape from the choices he had made. The eternal love he had been promised was nothing more than a cruel illusion, and he was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, with no hope of redemption. In the cold, unyielding walls of his prison cell, Mark Harrison's life became a daily torment of regret and sorrow. The once vibrant man who had sought eternal life now spent his days in isolation, haunted by the ghosts of his past. Every night he was plagued by nightmares of David's final moments, his best friend's eyes filled with betrayal and pain. The silence of his cell was broken only by his own anguished cries, begging for a forgiveness that would never come. The cult's promises of eternal love had turned into an eternal punishment, with Mark trapped in a cycle of guilt and madness. His existence, now a shadow of the man he once was, served as a grim reminder of the price he paid for chasing an impossible dream, an eternity of suffering with no end in sight. As Mark's tragic tale reminds us, the pursuit of forbidden desires can lead to devastating consequences. Betrayal, manipulation, and the cost of obsession. This story leaves us with haunting questions about the lengths one might go for what they believe is eternal love. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales that explore the darkest corners of human nature. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.